All you want to do is paint some miniatures, and you're dealing with these flip-top lids and spilled nun oil. Hey, Sky here from Emperor's Hobby with the super smart dropper bottle. That'll help you control your flow and minimize messes.
It's amazing!
Hey everyone, welcome back to the table. I'm Scott, and today we're going to talk about taking this and putting it into this. If you look at our wall of paint, you'll notice that many of our Citadel paints actually have been converted over to dropper bottles. There's a lot of things back and forth about converting the dropper bottles and not converting the dropper bottles. However, I just want to share some of the reasons we have done it. I like the Citadel paints and I enjoy using them. I started using Citadel paints in the very beginning because I had the most accessibility to them. Now, some people don't like those paints and that's fine. Use whatever you like. However, at the point that I started really getting into this, I was already invested, so I did not want to throw away those paints and I wanted to use them as much as possible. I also wanted to share the hobby with my children who were growing an interest into the hobby as well. So having paint pots were a bad idea. So that takes me to reason number one why I converted over. So reason number one is that flip top paint pots are not very accessible or usable for children. They're difficult to close. Oftentimes, even myself, I have to put some pressure overhand to be able to push them down all the way. If you open up the pot and realize that it's not shaken up all the way, you have to close it again and hope that you have closed it all the way. If you haven't and you start shaking it, it explodes everywhere. And this has happened a few times. The other thing is that it's very easy to spill a flip top paint pot. Makes it higher risk for children to use it. Reason number two is it's easier to measure my paint recipes if I have a dropper bottle. I can easily take and squeeze and get a couple drops out and repeat my paint recipe. Putting my brush in and scooping out the paint is not very repeatable. You can do the colors by sight and that's perfectly fine, but when I'm trying to repeat a recipe and make sure that my army is uniform over multiple sessions or months, drops are going to be a lot easier to measure than simply scooping the paint out. The next reason is that when you scoop the paint out, you actually have a higher risk of getting the paint into the ferrule of the brush. Now, once the paint gets into the ferrule of the brush, the bristles start to separate, and now you have a brush that's either ruined or not very usable. I don't know about you, but paintbrushes can be quite expensive. So the other reason is it also makes it incredibly useful if you're airbrushing. So now you can drop in your paint when you're airbrushing instead of having to scoop it out of a container and have that rolling around on your desk. The last reason that I like to use the dropper bottles is that it gives me the ability to pre-thin my paints. Now this isn't exclusive to a dropper bottle, but it is one of the things that I can do when I'm converting them over. So the dropper bottle, I can put some paint thinner in it. It works better than water and allows my paints to be able to come out smoother and more ready to be used. So we're going to get to converting over our paint pots. Now, not incredibly hard to do this. Like I said, it's pretty simple, but I think the method works best if you're doing multiples at a time. The tools that you're going to need to be able to do this is, one, you're going to need some empty dropper bottles. Now these dropper bottles, you can buy them in packs of 50. I'll put a link down below into our thing, but you can buy them for packs of 50. They come with the top that you can screw on, and you also get a little piece here that allows for the dropping. What I also recommend is that you buy some of the mixing balls that I mentioned earlier, assuming that the paint you're converting over doesn't already have them. The other thing that you're going to want is some thinner or flow improver, depending on how you want to do your paints. I recommend doing flow improver because it's going to smooth out your paints. You can't use this for everything. It works really well for acrylic paints, but it is horrible if you do it with your contrast paints. It will completely thin out your contrast paints. It'll make the color not as potent, and it will more than likely do some weird stuff to your model. So I do not recommend using that with contrast paints or with any types of washes. Now myself, I tend to use a mixture to put into the paint pot where it's actually 90% thinner and 10% flow. And I have that pre-mixed here, and it's actually the same mix that I use when I'm using my airbrush. So the other couple things that you're going to need is I recommend having some paper towels on hand. While this method, I've done it quite a few times and I haven't made a mess, it's still really helpful to have paper towel on hand. Planning to planning to clean up a mess is always better than panicking cleaning up a mess. I like to not use a funnel, partially because I don't want to waste extra paint that's going to get on the funnel that I won't be able to get out. The last thing you're going to want is some way to mix your paint. You can use any of the methods we described up above. I like this vortex mixer for this because it makes the process go very quickly. So we're going to do two different paints here. Paint number one is I'm going to use some Retributor Armor. It's a base paint from Citadel, and we use it quite frequently. It's our go-to gold paint. And so I'm going to use that one. And I'm also going to do some contrast paint, some Telesar Blue, which is another paint that we use quite often. So to start this process out, the first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we've unscrewed all of our bottles. I'm going to set up my bottles that are here of what I'm going to use. And then I set my paints next to them that I'm going to be doing. Now, why do I do that? One, I want to make sure I understand what the paint is that I'm putting inside the bottle. You can't always tell by sight, and you don't want to also mix it up. Make sure that I have my container or my top for both and my dropper for both already. When these come, this is going to be on top here and screwed together. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the paint and I'm going to open it up. So we're going to do that here. If you look inside of it, you can tell that it is not mixed up all the way. It's kind of separated, it looks a little weird, and that's all right. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is take one of these mixing balls, and put it inside of it. The next thing I'm going to do, because I know I'm going to need to thin it just a little bit, is I'm going to put a little bit of thinner in there. Not a lot, but just a little bit to be able to help mix this paint up. I will close this all the way, make sure it's completely closed, and then I'll use my vortex mixer to be able to mix up the paint. Once I have this completely mixed up, we're going to mix up the rest of these, and then we'll go from there. Now for the contrast paints, because these are so thin, I tend to not put a mixer ball in them. Over time, they don't really separate, so usually there's no need to have that extra agitation. However, if you want to be consistent or you simply want to put in there, it is not going to hurt. Okay, I have both of my paints mixed up. Then I'm going to put the edge of my paint, of the container I'm pouring into, against the edge of my dropper bottle. For Citadel in particular, there's an edge to this particular thing, and you can take and you're going to put this edge right up next to it. From there, you're going to slowly turn your bottle, and you're going to pour your paint in there. Now it's going to take it a little bit, just do it slow. Once the flow starts happening, it goes a lot quicker. And then you're just going to simply pour the paint into it. Now, one of the things that you can tell is that as you're pouring this in here, you can gauge the flow of the paint. And so what that means is that you can tell if you need to thin it more. So most of my container is now empty, as you can see in there. And you can see that my bottle isn't completely full. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually take and add more thinner to this. I didn't add a lot in the beginning, but I'm going to add more now. And what I want to do is get this so I can almost see through the edges and the sides of the container. I'm just going to add a little bit at a time and do that. All right, so now you can tell that the paint is a lot thinner, it has a lot more flow to it. Now this is going to vary greatly between paints. So I'm going to repeat the process that I did earlier, and I'm going to simply pour this in, going slowly. And since these are see-through, you just pay attention and make sure that you're not going to overfill your container. You don't want to overfill it. I take it right up to about where you're going to put where you can see the screw portion starts. You don't want to go too much more than that because you're going to lose a little bit of space when you put the top in. If you still have paint left in your pot, which you more than likely will depending on what happens, but you might, then it's perfectly okay. I would just make sure that this has a mixing ball in it. I would store this for later use You can come back and refill your paint. Once I've completed putting the paint inside the bottle, then from there you can take your top, your dropper top, you're going to put it on the top of your bottle. You're just going to push it in like that. And then if you got any paint on the edge, then you can simply use your paper towel. You're going to turn that, you're just going to wipe that off. And then your last step is you're going to have your paint in there all the way, is you're simply going to turn this and close your bottle. Now, the thing that I like to do is I will take I'll find the edge of the label here, because this has this nice fancy label on it that says what color it is. I like to take and peel this off of the paint pot that I'm using. I'll then put it onto whatever paint it is that I'm using. That way I can identify the paint directly in the bottle. Plus it looks cool, like it was meant to be there that way anyways. If I still happen to have paint left over in here, then I will simply write what the paint is. Later on, after I've used it, if I go through a big painting session where I'm using a lot of gold, maybe I'm painting a whole bunch of custodes or something, I'll actually go in and I'll squeeze some of the paint from this into this container, because there might not be a lot left in here, just a little bit. Shake it up, just like I just did, and then pour it and fill this up completely, and then I can toss this container. So I'm going to repeat this one more time a little quicker, but with this contrast paint. Now the contrast paint works a little bit differently. These bottles tend to be a little bit bigger depending on what you get them. More times than not, I have some left over. So this is actually a partial one that I used before. Process is going to be exactly the same. I'm going to take and put the paint on the edge. Ooh, this is a good thing to note, is that notice how the lid here is dripping just a little bit. You want to make sure that this is done all the way. Sometimes I like to flick it to be able to get that off. The other thing that you have is that if you have a completely full container, you can't put this back in because it's just going to dip it again. So you can just let it sit there and drip until it's done. So I'm going to follow the same exact process. I'm going to put this on the edge, just like this. This one's going to flow a little bit better, so it'll work, but I'm going to line up the edges. I'm going to pour slowly until it breaks the threshold. It starts going in. Once it starts flowing, then you can pour a little quicker. Again, I'll repeat the thing until it's completely full. Sometimes it helps if you pre-wipe the lid. Depends on which way you want to do it. Put the top on, screw this one on, and then we're going to peel the label off the used one, so we know which one this is. Toss that one in the garbage. There we go. And there you have it. We have two of these that are completely done in no time at all. Now, one by one, they take a while to do. But if you were to line up and say do 20, 30, 40 at a time, how many ever you have, you just simply line them up. I go through and I shake all of the paints. I do it assembly line style. So I shake up all the paints. Then I take and I'll make sure I get all the tops ready. I'll pour them into it. As I'm going through and pouring them, if I realize that the paint needs to be thinned a little bit more, I'll thin the paint and then I'll mix it. Because one of the things that happens is while it's sitting there, when the paint's down a little bit, that top drips. So it'll drip into the thing. So I don't have to go back and fill. The ones that I am able to complete or fill the bottle completely, I'll put the tops on them and finish it. But I won't move it away from the paint. I'll keep it lined up just like this, where the paint is next to the bottle the whole time. I do not want to mix up my paints. So I'll do that for the entire time. And then when I'm completely done and I've gone enough rounds where everything is full, then I will go through and peel off the label and put it onto the bottle and complete that all the way. Thanks for hanging out with me while we talked about converting our paints over into pots. If you have any questions or issues, let me know down in the comments. Be careful. Don't make too big of a mess. Make sure your area is protected. And until next time, when we see you at the table.